Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Des. I'm your host, Des Blanchfield, and today I have the pleasure of having Guy Shone in the studio with me today. Guy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Des. Great to be here.
Thanks for making time. So a quick introduction. Guy Shone, you're the CEO of an organization called Explain the Market, and you describe yourselves as economic researchers, and your tagline says that you aim to provide expert research in tune with a fast-moving, media-savvy world. And your company website is www.explainthemarket.com. Just give us a quick introduction to yourself, if you wouldn't mind, and then maybe just an overview of Explain the Market and the company and what it does.
Sure. I started life as an economist. I spent a period of time running the research department for a big global investment banking group. I then did what some people thought was quite a weird thing and went to become the research director for a sort of economic government agency in the UK, where we had the challenge of trying to make the whole population more financially savvy and more financially capable, which was a big kind of challenge to get involved in.
Wow.
And then I started because I've been writing reports for government agencies and various people, including the part of the G20. I ended up doing work on the BBC, explaining and trying to demystify economic events and financial news and things of that nature. And I ended up for a while becoming a full-time journalist. And I got to a point where I got this sense that there was a real need out there for top quality economic analysis, but something that was also at the same time able to engage people quickly. So, rather than having to wade through a 300-page report, an idea that it should be possible to deliver quality analysis, but do it in a way where you could actually engage the media, boardrooms, people making decisions in a much more impactful way, because we're all so busy. Hardly anybody I know has actually really got the time to read an 80-page report.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the thinking behind Explain the Market, and we also had done a lot of work around behavioural economics, and this kind of overarching principle that we ought to deal with people, whether it's boardroom decision makers or customers, as they really are, and not as we think they ought to be. And if we start to deal with people as they really are and understand their behaviour and their preferences, then we'll design things, whether they're products or financial vehicles or policies, we'll design things that actually make a better difference to people and make a better difference to the bottom line of businesses. So all of that thinking kind of mashed together, and we launched Explain the Market 3 years ago, and we've been busy and growing ever since. We've got clients in the States and clients obviously in the UK, and we've done work all over the world. And I'm busy. I don't sleep very much, but I've got two young kids. So I was not destined to sleep at this point in my life anyway.
No, you might as well maximize the time. Your social feed is evidence you don't sleep like many of us. It's interesting that some of the things you just mentioned there. I mean, is there such a thing as a profile of the typical company you might deal with? It seems to me that there isn't. I imagine you've targeted a few particular key industries because they're familiar, but I get the sense that this is the sort of thing that, from an advisory and research point of view, that's almost across the entire spectrum of all market sectors and industry groups, isn't it?
It is. We've got a lot of clients who are financial services clients, so banks and some new banks as well, some FinTech organisations, and that's quite exciting. But equally, IBM, for example, are a client of ours, and we've got some big brand names in the kind of fashion and even automotive space. So this need to understand the economic environment that we're operating in and communicate thought leadership. I mean, thought leadership's a horrible term, but it's unfortunately, I think, the only one that's available at the moment to describe this sort of work. The need to communicate research findings and kind of explanations of economic events in a way that everybody can understand seems to be, cutting across all sorts of different industries now. And I think 10 or 15 years ago, there would be a very different approach that I would have if I was talking at a conference or doing something for the Financial Times or a Bloomberg of this world, than if I were talking to a sort of tabloid organisation or a mass market organisation. Increasingly now, it's the requirement to be straightforward and cut to the so what as fast as possible applies right across the board. So you sort of don't get this sort of, well, if I try and use as big a word as possible or try and make this concept sound complex, it'll make me look clever and I'll be able to charge more for my services. That sort of approach, which I think was kind of dominant sort of 20 years ago, is dead now.
Yeah.
So you've got, there's nowhere to hide anymore, whether that's in the consulting engagement or whether that's in the text that you're putting into the newspaper.
One of the things I was talking about recently with some folk in this space, and I think it sort of comes close to describing what you're talking about, is that the rate of change and the pace of change is so fast and so broad that my way of describing it is that we're having to sprint just to keep up. But the key issue is we're having to sprint in multiple races all at the same time. And I think there are a lot of CEOs, excuse me, a lot of CEOs and their C-suite, and even a couple of tiers below them, who are becoming quite exhausted by this never-ending barrage of stuff coming at them of coinages and terminology and three-letter acronyms. And so I think you've got an amazing opportunity in the market here, which piqued my interest in what you're doing more than anything, that it's like a breath of fresh air for tonight, to go to them and say, look, let us just resuscitate where you're at, stop and check.
Sure.
And when we were talking earlier, you mentioned a concept that I'd love to dive into, and it's something that apparently you were looking into recently, which is this idea that around the role that technology plays in the boardroom today, and what that means from an operational point of view, from a decision-making point of view. I'd love to get some insight into kind of where that came from and how it's playing out currently.
Well, we've been this. I've been looking at this for many years. This sort of intersection between leadership, culture, change, and technology. But more recently, IBM asked us to take a look into how the roles of the CIO and the CFO and other roles around the boardroom table are changing. And we found we did a lot of research both in the UK but also in the US as well, and we found that not just the pace of change, but just the character of the change that these roles are going through is really unprecedented. So you're having to if you were the CIO 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you had your internal customers, and you had your challenges, but they were fairly, reasonably limited to a couple of different sections of the organization. If you're the CIO now, every person around that boardroom table is your internal customer.
Yeah.
So there's very little room now between your typical Fortune 500 CEO and the role of the CIO. What you provide is the engine room of growth. You provide the ability to get all of your operational change functions and change programs delivered. You need to be the best buddy of the CFO, who herself is having a huge kind of change forced upon them. You've got CFOs now have got to do more with analytics. They've got to deliver margin and growth opportunities. Both of those things rely on the CIO, and they've got to cope with this sort of multifarious, scary risk environment where you're not allowed to say which risk is a low priority. Everything is high priority, and so you've got there's very little room for sort of thinking about where you might save time and save energy. Everything is extremely important, and of course there's less time to get all this done in because you've got so many other issues and challenges to work through too. So I think the role of the CFO, the pressure and challenges that the CIO is under these days requires partnership, and it requires a particular type of partnership. It requires so much more hands-on support, so much more strategic support than ever I think has been the case in the past. So when we go out and we talk to CIOs, they almost talk about three types of problem that they're having to resolve right now, all sort of concertinaed together. They've got this sort of day-to-day operational change program. So either it could be a data migration, IT estate migration program that's happened off the back of some M&A activity, or it could be any one of a number of the big legacy change programs that go on in big organisations, and the way in which they need to manage that and the way in which they need to report to the board on that is a fairly typical traditional way of working and managing and leading people. But then on top of that, they've got this sort of mid-level piece which is half delivery, half conceptual, which are typified by something like cloud migration strategy. Then on top of that, they've got very conceptual pieces of work, but which are very high ticket when it comes to boardroom attention, which things like blockchain strategies would fit into that category. Each of those different areas of work are they're not just different in terms of how they're resourced, they're different in terms of how you need to think about them and how you need to communicate your progress. So you can put it, even in my description of that, it's quite an exhausting sounding set of challenges that people have got. So it means the right sort of help becomes absolutely critical, and that's something that we're going to continue to look at as we continue this work with IBM.
I think I was making some notes while you were just covering those three key points, because I think they're quite salient things to just quickly dive into here, if you don't mind. To me, when you were talking about the operational challenges, number one, versus more of a digital strategy piece in number two, and then number three, I sort of thought more of an innovation and development thing. When you think about the cultural and behavioural requirements of each of those, I mean, operational change, upgrading your mail server from Office 123 to Office 345, there isn't a lot of education or evangelizing or transformation to be done. We're going from email to email, and you're just getting a new look and feel and some new functions and that isn't very exhaustive. It's just a lot of work, right? But it's not like a sprinting race at a 100-yard dash. It's a marathon, and we're all relatively used to those, and we've been doing those for 60 years of computer technology history. Yeah. I totally agree with number two in that everything from the high-level strategy and the policies and the governing frameworks and the evangelizing and the championing of new concepts like blockchain and IoT and smart infrastructure and smart cities and autonomous vehicles and that whole wash of you could list them all day, right? Cloud, big data, analytics, IoT, cyber risks, cyber resilience. I mean, you could put people to sleep by just listing them. That's how exhaustive they are. And I think that's the bit more than anything that's just wearing people down, because now you're not just doing something operational. It's like, we got a new upgrade of XYZ, traditional systems. It's a whole new religion, a whole new creed, and you've got to get people to buy into the value. Transitioning from old style security and data protection through to blockchain. Like, what does it even mean? We're going to have a hyperledger that logs everything. Well, at what level? And I've seen that just wear companies down on a single program of work. So when you add 3 or 4, I can imagine that just gets off the chart. It's okay.
The stakeholder burden as well is another sort of byproduct of all of that. In that, as these technologies get the attention of governments and the media, that you inherit a whole load more stakeholders to try and manage than you ever had before. Autonomous vehicle technology is the same. The beginnings of how to try and get groups together in industry to think about how we might self-regulate this, and then the media have got some interest, and then there's some testing which requires expertise, and then blockchain now is becoming similar. It's a never-ending. Everybody around that boardroom table is looking at you if you're the CIO, and that I think is only going to get even more demanding.
And I think we're on that point. I think we've seen I've certainly seen a transition now, where for a while CIOs were effectively removed from the boardroom because no one really understood what they're talking about because they were very, very technical.
Sure.
I think CIOs are coming back to the boardroom for all the reasons you're talking about. But what I'm noticing is the type of pedigree that they have is no longer purely practitioner, technical, hands-on capability with a bit of business rubbed in. They're coming in with MBAs, and they've come in with a business background, and they've learnt enough about the technology to deliver these innovations and implementations and new rollouts and so forth. But they can just, deal with the Pax Americana in many ways, or whatever we want to call it, the lingua franca of the boardroom, that they expect plain English, no TLAs, what's going on, and keep it, explained to me like I'm a 3-year-old. I don't know what that's going to mean long term, but it certainly has been a turnaround where the CIO and team are being brought back into the boardroom. The other thing I was interested in getting your thoughts on, just as a segue, is what are you seeing, given your amazing position in the space and ability to get behind the boardroom door? What are you seeing with the shift in the CXO roles that are coming out? I mean, if we see the traditional sort of the board established with advisory board and then an operational functional board themselves, and then you've got the CEO sort of championing that, and underneath the CEO, he or she might have a CFO and a CIO and a CRO. You've got marketing, finance, information technology, etc. But now we're seeing other roles. I mean, I saw one yesterday that just made me chuckle, but then I thought maybe I shouldn't laugh, and that was Chief User Experience Officer. And we've obviously a Chief Risk Officer is a changing role now, and more so when you're in different industries. There's a big difference between a chief risk officer in banking, wealth management, and finance versus a chief risk officer inside logistics and transport. One's worrying about not getting people run over and killed on the road in cars and trucks, and the other's worrying about brand value and shareholder return. Sure. But now we've got things like the GDPR, for example, the Global Data Protection Regulation, and we've seen this creation of a data protection officer role, which in effect is another C-suite type role. And the linkages of who's reporting to where. I mean, you're alluding to the challenges that a CIO has now, where they don't just report to the CEO or the CFO. They've got, everyone's their customer. I saw the DPO, or Chief Data Protection Officer, come up and thought, wow, again, everybody is going to need to talk to that person. That person's going to have to champion the concept. And it's not just the likes of Europe's GDPR. It's we've had the EU-US Data Shield. In Australia, we've got the Australian Privacy Act. Germany's got similar things. India and China are working on similar programs now. That in itself, there's such a shift in roles. I just wonder whether we're CXOing ourselves to death.
Well, I think that's the example. The data regulation example is a really good one, I think, to highlight how this sort of cause and effect can work, because I think so often now you get these new roles established, and part of the reason for it is a need to demonstrate to the investment community, particularly, but also the wider media around the organisation, that you have this very important thing under management.
Right.
That you're taking this, you're taking this as seriously as you could possibly take it. And one great way to demonstrate that is to say, we've created this new role, and it is in inverted commas, C-level role.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I think there is that's part of it. Now, that's not to suggest that that's the entire reason for doing it, or that it's somehow superficial and without serious content, but I think that's nevertheless something that you see that a lot. There's some macro events, or there is some regulatory driven change, or there is some demand side shift, either for or against something, and these new roles get created. In a less serious way, you might say that's chief happiness officer and things. It's kind of it's the same dynamic playing out in a slightly different way. I think the other reason for the C-suite getting more crowded is just an inevitable consequence of globalization and of managing organizations across so many different territories, and managing organizations that have so much sort of necessary complexity, I guess, built into them.
Yeah.
That how do you organise when you're in 100 countries, and you're in not just 20 different product areas, but 20 different industries. How do you control and manage that and report to your investors on what you're on the progress that you're making? So I think that's part of it. But then I think perhaps to a lesser degree, the other thing is just it has become a bit of a fad and a fashion to have C at the front of your job title, and maybe that's not always maybe it's not always essential to do that. If you've got only one or two layers of management underneath you, well then it does make a bit of a mockery of sort of a situation to call yourself the chief something when there are either no other somethings or just one other something in the organisation.
It's one of those too many chiefs and not enough cooks, or too many chiefs and not enough Indians, as they say. But so we see that in Europe and the UK and the US and even Australia. A lot of these companies that get to the size are public companies, but I've seen a really interesting shift coming out of Southeast Asia, particularly India and China more than ever, but Malaysia and Indonesia as well, where there's a lot of very large privately owned companies who are struggling with this whole corporate structure thing as well, and that is they're billion-dollar companies, but they're actually privately owned, or they're owned by a family. It brings me back to that original topic, though, and that is that when we think about this interesting shift backwards and forwards around the structure of the companies and the reporting lines and the challenges of everybody wants to be a CXO. And your research talked about this role that technology plays in the boardroom, and more, and I think you mentioned it in a previous conversation we had, we're seeing people walking around with live dashboards on digital tablets. My favorite is to see someone walking along with an iPad Pro or an A4 sized Android tablet from the likes of Huawei or Samsung, and they've got all this data flowing, and I think you used the term everyone is now a data scientist per se, which is something that's been bandied around. But it kind of brings me back to that topic that you were talking about, and I'm keen to see what you learnt from that research around this role that technology plays in the boardroom, because each of these people now are not only dealing with the CIO and not only dealing with different disruptions and change, but they're also having to make decisions based on data. And we hear the phrase data-driven decision making, and I'm wondering what you've learned or what you've gleaned from the recent research you did in this space as to what impact that's having. Is it good or bad? Are we doing something crazy? We're just we are suffering a glut of data.
I think yes, we are. But I think there is a real opportunity, but we're not quite grasping yet. And I think we're emerging from a period where big data combined with great analytical tools has sort of got everybody very excited and engaged, because the tools are better and the analytical capability is better, more and more people are now engaged, and as you said, and I've said this before too, that everybody now is a data scientist. Everybody is able to come up with their own analysis and their own insights. So everybody sort of understands what's possible.
Right.
The problem with that is that you still have to make a decision.
Yeah.
So what I think we need to move to now, and I think some companies are starting to do this, is that combination of great data, great analytical tools, but also not to neglect the art and skill of decision making, which is a skill in its own right. And if you're trying to grow a small business very fast, if you're trying to maintain a huge, large, complex organization, you can't really do that very successfully for very long if you're letting the database make the decisions for you. And I think in some cases we've slipped into that culturally, where we sort of get into this idea that that data equals fact equals truth, and actually that's of course wrong. That we need to be able to understand that we've got hundreds now of people in the organization, or thousands of people in the organization, or tens of thousands of people in the organization who are able to see what we can see and come up with their own conclusions and report ideas to us. But ultimately, we as a C-level team need to make a call, and we need to develop that muscle just as much as we're developing the technology that's helping us to make those decisions.
I had a funny line a couple of years ago. I was at a thing by a group called Chile here in Chile in Australia, and they do like an electronic law or a forum, and this kind of just popped out of my head, and then someone tweeted it or reminded me I'd said it. But when it comes to data, I think it's one of those things where if you torture data long enough, it will eventually speak. But the challenge is to know how long to torture it, right? And I remember having a conversation around this topic with an associate of ours, Dr. Bob Hayes in the US, and he said, something along the lines that, it doesn't matter which angle you come at your data from, it will tell you a story, but the challenge is to know what story you want it to tell you. And I kind of looked around, what does that mean? But it reminds me of two things, spreadsheeting and PowerPointing. Often it's like that scenario of somebody in a high-vis jacket with a clipboard in a crowd often is the person everyone goes to ask where are the bathrooms and where can I get out here. So some guys in Australia did an experiment recently where they put high-vis jackets on and walked around with clipboards, and they got into almost everywhere. They got into shows for free. They got into some really, really big events. They got into some highly secure spaces, and no one questioned them because they just presented data that gave an outcome that they wanted in this perception. And I think we are at a point now where, as you said, we don't necessarily know how to make decisions on that data. Often, if it's the typical 5 V's of high velocity, high volume data, and in high variety, there's so much of it coming from so many angles. I mean, imagine when you're making a decision on just security sensors or something to that effect, and you're getting all this input. It reminds me of standing in front of some environments I built in my previous lives around security and IT infrastructure, where we used to build network operation centers, and we'd build a security section of that. And you'd have this what we call a NOC, network operation center. In the NOC, we would have lots of big panels and projectors showing things like routers and switches and servers and firewalls and uptime. And it would just be this glut of graphics and information. But of course, when things went red, it gave you a quick indicator of what to go and chase and put out fires. But when we did the same thing for what we called a security operations center, a SOC, we found that it was the inverse. In the network operations center, when you saw a red dot, you could chase it down and find out which router had failed or switch or server had failed. In the security space, it was almost a case, well, you are always under attack. You are always being port scanned. Yeah. You are always being probed. And so people got to this point where they just had decision fatigue. They couldn't work out which way to go, when to go, how to go. It's kind of like making a decision in the middle of a tornado. If it's spinning around you, it doesn't matter which direction you're going to get caught up in it.
Yeah.
I've had a couple of scenarios where we've done little workshops with people, and we've done them in half-an-hour sets, half an hour before lunch, half an hour after lunch. And the first half an hour, we bring everyone a laptop or a tablet and say, right, here's a BI or CRM or analytics tool or some form of utility that gives us lots of data, lots of decision making, and here's some pre-built dashboards. Here are 3 scenarios we need to play through. Each of you write down on a piece of paper and stick it on a post-it note on the left wall what you think the problem is, and then go to the right wall and stick on the answer you would put forward. And invariably, we found that if there were 10 people, we'd get 11 answers. And the whole point of that was illustrating that, every single person interpreted the same data and the same dashboards in different ways and made different decisions. And then we took all the technology away and we did the same thing with 3 other scenarios. And we found that invariably more than 50% came out with the same problem being understood and the same answer coming out. Ergo, they were able to make decisions. And then we didn't highlight that technology was the problem. It was more so their ability to deal with technology and the training and the skills and the experience they had around it and the speed at which things are happening. I don't really know where this is going to take us, but it was just an interesting wake-up call for me as well. And it's like, well, what decisions am I making based on data every day?
Well, totally. I think this is a big area, and to me, it makes me think about that word context, and so, if in the type of work that I do, often you'll have that sort of commonly used thing on slide decks where people will talk about correlation is not causation,
right?
And everyone will agree. And there'll be normally a chart about cheese consumption with, I don't know, polar bears dying or something, and you'll see the 2 lines go together quite nicely. And we'll all agree that correlation is not causation.
No.
But then often what that's used to do is to justify almost entirely quantitative piece of work. And that may be fine for some things, but when it comes to people and decision making, that's inherently flawed. And you've just touched on some of that, and we found this a lot when we were doing a lot of work around financial decision making. That actually the way we behave is overwhelmingly governed by emotional factors, and yet we don't like to admit that. I mean, none of us do. We like to tell each other that we're rational and logical, and of course we wouldn't do that. And often actually it can be much easier to go into a boardroom and give a report that is not necessarily very truthful, so it doesn't reflect the truth, but there is a lot of data backing it up. It's often much easier to do that than it is to go into a boardroom and tell something that's much more truthful, but the data the data supporting it is qualitative in nature, so it doesn't feel as valid. So and I've seen that time and time again where there are certain things where actually you don't even need a lot of quantitative data to know what the right call is. But we tend sometimes to shy away from that, and it was a huge eye opener for me doing a lot of work a few years ago, specifically on families with very low incomes, and watching how they managed money and how they thought and felt about finances. And we would do these ethnographic studies where we just spend lots of time with people in situ, and really trying to understand the context of their lives. And you see situations. I remember going to a focus group that I still remember to this day, where I was sat behind the screen with lots of various VIPs there was somebody there from the US government, somebody from the UK government. We're all sat there observing this study, and a lady at one point turned to the people that she knew were behind the glass, so that she couldn't see us, and said, my daughter wants to go on a school trip on Monday, and it's going to cost £100, and I don't have £100. And when I suggested to her yesterday that she may not be able to go, she burst into tears in front of me. You say not to, you say that actually I shouldn't get myself into debt to pay for her to go. But a payday lender have told me they'll have the money ready for me the day before.
Yeah.
So they've told me they can stop my daughter from crying, what is your counter offer to me?
It's
And we talked
impossible
about it over dinner.
situation, right?
But we realised our counter offer, and millions have been spent strategizing, and our counter offer was a very well phrased leaflet and a nicely constructed website. And we thought, that's like going into the ring against Mike Tyson and trying to hit him with a daffodil. It's going to have absolutely no effect at all.
Yeah, and
at the same time, so I think we all need encouragement to be able to try and sit the data in context, and then we'll be able to focus our limited energy and resources on stuff that might have a chance of working.
Well, it's that scenario where one of the outcomes of my pet little projects recently along these lines was, I said, if you put yourself in a situation where you have got a gun at your head, you are going to make bad decisions no matter what. And I can imagine that scenario with that poor parent. And we've all been in that scenario in various forms, not necessarily just the financial, but just a whole range of moral or commercial or just time and logistics problems of, I can't get you to school soccer and to the play date and to the birthday party and afford to buy you a new dress and do your homework. And so you get to that scenario where you're making decisions with that proverbial gun pointed at your head. And it's an impossible scenario, particularly if it's financial, where someone can give you money based on a pending pay date, a payday, because nobody in their right mind wants their daughter to cry. Nobody wants their daughter to be sad. And somebody's going to opportunistically give you that solution, and it's going to always, hands down, beat a website saying, live frugally and sensibly, no matter what you do.
Exactly, but there's a similar principle, and I think why aspects of behavioural economics really excite me is that similar principles, you see play out in boardroom dynamics and amongst that sort of C-suite, and I used to run a department for a big company, and I can remember those days of negotiating and planning together and working with other teams, and often it's very unfashionable to talk about what you're going to deprioritize.
Yeah.
So more and more stuff is added to your mandate, to the agenda, and thinking through on your own how you're going to deliver what you've been told to deliver, you naturally think about those spinning plates that you're going to let drop. But of course, that's not that you can't communicate that. And similarly, boards, when they're communicating to their investor community, often feel, we have profit warnings and things, but we don't really embrace this. What if we were really open about the challenges, and could we then work together more effectively and actually really smash these targets, because we're not wasting energy having sort of slightly dishonest conversations.
Yeah, and I think more and more companies are going to have those reality checks. I mean, and I'm not calling out for any reason other than just it was something that came to mind in a conversation recently. But Hewlett and Packard, for example, I mean, they've had to make some very big, hard decisions in the last decade, particularly the last 3 to 5 years, where they've sort of gone through that also ran process of trying to be a cloud provider and committed to OpenStack, the open source cloud platform, very heavily. Had a platform called Helion. And then ran their own public cloud for a while. I stood a whole bunch of stuff in it myself for projects, only to find that sometime later they realized that it wasn't a good direction for them, and they actually shut the whole thing down. So you had a period of time to get out of there. That must have been a very painful decision to make and a very painful thing to communicate. And then they broke up consumer versus enterprise, and we ended up with HP Consumer and HP Enterprise, HPE. And the changes keep going, and they acquired various things and been in all kinds of M&A acquisition processes, and then killed things. I mean, I saw a report the other day where someone, I think it was like 85 or 83 things that Yahoo had acquired under Marissa Meyer's lead and so forth. And there was a whole bunch of commentary around, was this a good investment? Did this bring value? I can only imagine the decision-making process on how they acquired it, how they then defocused it, and then how they had to report it publicly. It brings me to another little side note that I made while we were chatting here around not just the role that technology plays in the boardroom, but across the business. Because in a conversation earlier, we talked about this challenge of not just decision-making on technology, but also on data, data-driven decisions, but also that technology is driving and underpinning almost everything we do these days, whether it's blockchain and other things. And so now we've got not just the C-suite having to kind of be answered to by the CIO, but we've seen shadow IT become a thing. People started just picking up the credit card and buying a CRM online, and companies like Salesforce leverage that very nicely, and I suspect they even produced that concept. But now we've got a scenario where CIOs are having to not just interfaced with all the C-suite, all the people under them, but they're having to be so broad sweeping and so deep in their depth of knowledge and technology that I imagine they can't actually support all that. So I think I read a thing the other day about Adobe where their CIO was just inundated with the demand from over 50 different parts of the business. So the CEO and the board decided to let the CIO focus purely on the core infrastructure and systems that they needed to run the business itself. But all the innovative and disruptive technology was allowed to be done in shadow IT form without even the need of keeping the CIO up to date. So in effect, I think I read, and I could be quoting the wrong number, but I believe it was a number like 56 different CIO-type roles inside all these little divisions of the Adobe organization globally, who in effect were operating like a CIO and delivering disruptive or innovative or transformative or operational change in the way that the CIO might have had to do previously. Now, I don't know what the impact's going to be like that, but it seems like it's allowed them to disrupt themselves internally and to pivot on a number of things, and they've remained a world leader in their key market segments. But I just wonder if in 3 to 5 years' time, they're all going to then let those little interim CIOs go, or they'll move and merge into other roles, and then all of a sudden the CIO proper is going to be told, well, you've now got 56 different environments to consolidate and reduce cost and reduce risk and increase uptime, and this person just sits there laughing saying, you are kidding, right? I mean, which part of my warning didn't you get?
Sure. It's an interesting point, that, because I think you see that same effect, not just in Adobe, but in lots of organisations across the globe, and it does seem to generate real disruption in a positive sense, and better products that are closer in touch with what customers need. There seems to be a speed of delivery, and just it seems to be an all-round positive thing to do. The problem, though, you're right, becomes when you move out of R&D, or you move into what you're developing, taking up a greater share of the company's revenue, then you start to face a tougher risk environment. It's harder to sort of fend people off and say, just let my team work on this for 3 months and we'll come up with something great for you. It's kind of, when what you're coming up with represents 25% of our revenue for, I'm afraid I'm not going to leave you alone for 3 months to come up with, and actually what you come up with is going to have to fit this, and it's going to have to, focus it on that territory first rather than all territories. So I think there's an inevitable reality check coming for where firms have organised in that way, but I don't necessarily think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think what you might find is that the sort of effect on culture of allowing those sort of smaller groups to be self-contained and slightly more free in their disruption actually might kind of stay with the company even after a little bit more of a sort of tougher risk environment inevitably sort of comes down on the structure of things.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a come to Jesus moment at some point, though, in that I come from a deeply technical background myself, and I've had to come through the ranks and learn about program delivery and sales and marketing and risk, and to the point where I've not only worn the CIO hat, but I've established what I tend to promote these days, which is the office's CIO, which is not just one person but a consortium of, or at least a quorum of 3+ people who are able to function
Sure.
in part with that, right? And what I've noticed is that you're absolutely right. I mean, this this demand. I mean, the terms like celebrity experience. I mean, how do you deliver a celebrity experience when your customers are traditional banking clients, for example? It's like, well, I want to go to a branch and get money out. I want to go to an ATM and get money out. I want to go to internet banking. So where do you provide a celebrity experience in that space? And all of a sudden you've got some exciting marcoms and PR people promoting the ability to deliver that because everyone else is saying they are. You've got people who are trying to build a capability around that to give you, low doc, high speed decision making on cards and loans, such as that poor parent with a crying daughter. But then, so you've got that fail and fail fast thing happening. But somebody the other day said to me, well, what we're finding inside our bank with fail and fail fast is it just means we're failing faster. And we're not necessarily getting great outcomes. And I said, well, perhaps it's time just to give yourself a 90-day breather and say, let's lock things down, go into change freeze for 90 days and just regroup. Because are you going to lose that much business in the next 90 days coming up to the end of the Australian financial year in comparison to some of your other competitors who are unlikely to roll something out that quickly, no matter what they sell? And it was interesting that, a week or so later I got this call and this person said, and I won't name the brand because they haven't gone public yet, but they said, this is the best thing we've done for a long time. It's given us a chance to catch our breath and regroup and realize that we were just going crazy trying to keep up with the Joneses, as it were. And it turns out the Joneses were trying to keep up with us, and it was all just smoke and mirrors. And so, in effect, we're going back to our grassroots and saying, what is core banking? And, what are the 2 or 3 things that people really need and want? They want to do things online. That's great. Well, we don't have an app for wealth management. We don't have an app for private or premium banking. Let's do that because that's where the biggest gains are going to be for us. Whereas we don't need people in yellow cars and pink cars driving around doing private in-home home lending opportunities, because we can hit 1 million people an hour with an intelligent app that's marketed right and evangelized right. We can only hit 1 person an hour with a 1-hour session, a person in a pink car who takes half an hour to drive to your house. And there's a big difference between this funky idea versus true innovation.
I mean, you're right. That there is. This is part of the problem. You used the analogy at the start of the conversation about the sort of 10 different lanes running at once, and I think part of the challenge with that is if you're not able to come up for air and just to kind of step back, periodically and try and think, okay, what am I actually doing here, and how is it really what my customers want, and is it actually all adding financial commercial benefit to the business? Well, then you work on the assumption that each of those lanes is all equally important and all incredibly important, and you burn up a huge amount of energy. You never know which lane you can just close off.
No, exactly.
And one of the fast-growing industries where I think this is prevalent is in FinTech, where there have been some great product developments, and there's a really fantastic and very positive culture developing of innovation and some great ideas. But I think at the same time, that part of the sort of byproduct of all of that is people have sort of forgotten to check what the rest of the world thinks, or whether customers really want the products that are being developed. Yeah. And you're almost sleepwalking into a sort of classic problem of supply side economics, where you've got 20,000 enthusiasts all in one big metaphorical room, slapping each other on the back, saying what a great job we've done, and wasn't it a fantastic conference, and can't wait for the next conference in October, and aren't we all great? Meanwhile, you've got 100 million potential customers who frankly couldn't care less, and the fact that they couldn't care less isn't entirely down to the fact that they don't understand. Many of them do and can understand, and their conclusion, even after understanding, is that they don't think it's that impressive. Which we of course find intolerable. It's sort of what they must. Perhaps they don't understand how brilliant this product is. It's like, well, perhaps they don't want it. Think about what this is. It's a bank, or it's a way of transporting their goods, or so I think it's really important, particularly when the pace of change is so rapid, and we have so little time to think things through properly. It's particularly important that we try and understand context and bring that sort of contextual element into the way in which we make decisions.
I'm going to quote you on something, actually, because I remember reading a report that you were commissioned to produce recently for, I think it's Starling Bank, and there was a really great line there, and I actually printed that page out because it jumped out at me. And it was something along the lines that whilst no longer a nascent industry, having moved into the mainstream, the narrative has become stuck in its own echo chamber and lost sight of its original purpose, which was empowering customers. And I went through and highlighted bits, and that I really loved that because it reminded me of a scenario where I did some consulting for a taxi firm recently here in Australia, who were one of the premium taxi brands and were doing really, really well, and they were first in innovations like having private taxi ranks through the city, where you could walk up to one of these things and you could guarantee there would be one of these a uniformed driver with a clean car and so forth. And then they had a phone taxi service with interactive voice, and then they had a web page. But they got caught up in this whole keeping up with the Ubers of the world, and they just sunk themselves in spending money everywhere trying to figure out how to be another Uber. And when I caught up with them, I said, well, actually, there's only one aspect of Uber I think you need to implement. And I gave it to them as free advice because they didn't have any money left for consulting. And I said, just go and build an app, a mobility app, put it on iPhones and tablets and so forth, and just clean up your website. Because I don't think people want the Uber experience from you, because you've got a long-running group of clients like myself who want this this premium service taxi thing, and I won't name the brand. But so off they went, and 2 months later they released an app, and they had a 4,000% increase in uptake of people ordering a taxi on their phone, on the side of the street, or in the office, because the messaging all came back through the app saying, yes, we've confirmed your booking, this is your driver name, they are approximately 8 minutes away. So we took the Uber concepts that made sense for that taxi business and applied just the bits that they really needed. But what we did is we actually went through this process where they rang 100 people in every area, every major postcode, and said, what are the top 3 things that you want from us? And it all came down to these basic, okay, we'd like an app, but we want it really simple. We want it to know where we are, because you can figure out where my phone is. We want a short list of the places we've been, because I'm pretty much a repeat offender. And I want it to be two-touch. Yes, I'm ready to go now, or I want to do it later, et cetera, et cetera. And so they had this 4,000% increase in acquisition of customers they already had versus new customers, just by not trying to be the Ubers of the world, but by just trying to pick out the eyes of the good bits that Uber people liked of the Uber experience without all of the chaff. And the other one that I've been sitting on the sidelines of that isn't very sexy but really stirs me, because education, I think, is a real issue globally now, and particularly Australia. We've dropped out of the top 50 countries in the world with education, is universities. We have universities in Australia spending billions and billions of dollars putting more buildings in place for people to sit in rooms and auditoriums and be lectured to. And it really struck me that this was just a really dumb idea. And of course, the unis don't like being told that, because the larger the university you manage and the more real estate you've got, the more important you are as a vice-chancellor. But my idea was, hang on a second. We know online education works. What if every one of the 11,000 lecturers in Australia was sent home with a decent laptop and camera and headset like the one you bought today for $50? And they did 2 lectures, one in the morning, one in the morning and one in the afternoon for 1 hour, right? So that's 11,000 people doing 2 lectures a day. That's 22,000 new pieces of content a day. And of course, once you've produced it, it can be played over and over. And then you put it on the iTunes University and all the other podcasting platforms, and you sell it for $1.99 per hour per course. Now, I don't think it's very difficult, and I'm sure your economics background can guarantee this. My math showed that in the first year we generate $2 trillion of uptake and new interest, because we weren't just selling to the 400 kids in the auditorium. We weren't selling to just the 2,000 or 3,000 students in that university. There were 7 billion people on the planet, not just children, but adults who might want to do for $1.99 a 1-hour lecture on insert name of topic 24/7, because of any hour of the day, of every day of the week, and every internet-connected place on the planet. And remember, you could do offline versions and sell it in DVDs as well. $2 trillion was my rough estimate per year, just in the first year going forward, of new revenue from something we're already doing, but locking in buildings and making it really hard to register and participate and engage in. And yet they just looked at me and rolled their eyes and went, no, you don't understand universities. And I was like, I think the you don't understand bit is on the wrong foot. Now, to me, I
But
want to.
I think
Yes, sorry, go.
so. I think ideas like that, and I think that's a great idea, and I think ideas like that are going to become increasingly possible as the world becomes more entrepreneurial, which inevitably is. You've got 5 to 10 million micro business owners in the UK. You've got 20 to 30 million in the US. You've got 100 million small businesses across the world who are owned just by women. You've got there are these huge changes that are occurring where people are just they're just opting out of the traditional structures of society, and they're kind of saying, well, you know what, I want to decide how I make this work. I want to decide how I consume that information. And so I think what you've just put forward is actually really exciting, and I think it fits with the way things are going.
And it's going to be a topic for us to do yet another show. Now, we're coming up to the hour, so one of the things I'd love to do before we wrap up is I love the idea of getting a bit of crystal ball gazing. If we were going to, and let's split it up into two parts, if you don't mind. Firstly, just yourself. Where do you see yourself going in the next 3 to 5 years around this whole space? What do you think the key takeaways we can share with listeners today are for you personally, as far as what your background brings and what you can offer in a very unique form as one of very few on the planet that've got the view you have? Where do you see yourself in 3 to 5 years in this space?
Well, I do a lot of work on television and in what you might call the mainstream press, although increasingly that term's becoming moribund, I think. I'm going to be doing a lot more online and a lot more things like this, where we can actually get under the skin of some of these issues, right, and open them up for more and more people to get involved in. And it's always been an aim of mine with Explain the Market and what we stand for, that everybody should be welcome to come and take part in this debate, that you don't need to be an economics professor, you don't need to be a CEO, that actually we want as many people getting involved in understanding and sort of pulling apart these big issues as possible. So that's going to be a real driving force for me. I think when it comes to businesses, I think there's some of the short-term challenges are around how do you keep delivering on those legacy challenges that you've got. So how do you deal with cloud transition effectively, whilst at the same time, finishing off your sort of data migration projects that are those traditional sort of challenges that we've spoken about, at the same time as getting much more on the front foot when it comes to things like AV tech and blockchain, where you're going to be challenged not just to come up with conceptual projects or run, randomized control trials on things or come up with strategy ideas, but actually make this operational and have us be reassured as a board that we can start to rest some of our, some of the real revenue that we're going to predicate our business on. You can be relied on to deliver that through this new tech. That's going to put a lot of people under pressure, and it's going to be difficult to do. And making that transition at the same time as not dropping any balls on that sort of legacy piece is going to require a lot more emphasis on partnership and a lot more judgment about who to partner with. And I think you've also got some other big demand side trends that just, momentum isn't just stopping on. You look at mobile adoption, particularly in Central African countries. You look at the increase around those countries as well in terms of air travel and kind of new territories opening up where people have got ideas and money to spend and are hungry for mobile video content. So we're going to need to understand as boardrooms these macro trends, and we're going to need to understand the trends beyond just the data points, beyond just the reports we get. We're going to need to develop the skill of understanding, and I think part of that is about effective communication. So I think, my prediction and my hope is that we're going to be increasingly busy over the next few years. And it's important. It's often important to produce thorough economic reports, and to sort of get our heads down and do very in-depth analysis. But it's equally important to make sure that we engage people in these topics, because we all learn more when more people get involved in the conversation. And I think, the last thing I would want to do would be to end up falling victim to sort of, some sort of intellectual snobbery type groupthink where,
right.
We sort of, we only hear from other people who look and sound like us, and have a similar educational background, and, chat to each other in the same airport lounges. So, that's there's a lot of stuff going on, but I think it's really all about understanding where the world is going to a depth that's going to enable much better decision making.
Oh, the great wrap up. So we're up on the hour. So just to close out, folks, if you would have definitely gleaned a lot from this hour. To keep in touch with Guy Shone, who's the CEO of an organization called Explain the Market, who provide research and advisory services around economic and key business issues around the world. Visit explainthemarket.com and follow Guy on Twitter. He's at Guy, G-U-I, Shone, S-H-O-N-E. I follow him. He tweets regularly. It's evidence that he probably doesn't sleep, and always something interesting to say. Guy, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for making time to catch up.
Likewise, Des. It's been a real pleasure, and look forward to catching up again.
Indeed, we're going to. I've made many notes, and we're going to do many follow-on shows. So, folks, we're up on the hour. I hope you got something from the show. We'll be back on air with Guy Shone sometime soon on more topics. Thanks for tuning in, and Guy, thanks so much for making time. And you've been on another Conversations with Des podcast episode, and thanks for your time.